Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most intense and dramatic events in ancient history, the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Now, this wasn't just any siege. It was a game changer that would reshape not only Jewish history but also the Roman Empire and the development of early Christianity. So picture this. It's the year 70 CE, and the Roman army, led by the future Emperor Titus, is closing in on Jerusalem. The city had become the center of Jewish resistance during the First Jewish-Roman War, and things were tense to say the least. Rebel factions had taken control of the city after a wave of chaos and rebellion against Roman rule. Now, the Romans, being Romans, didn't mess around when it came to sieges. They began surrounding the city right around Passover, which is when Jerusalem would have been packed with people. Over the next few weeks, they battered their way through the outer walls. They managed to breach 2 of them, but the rebels were tough. They put up a fierce fight and held their ground behind the thickest and final wall. But while the Romans were pushing in from the outside, life inside the city was falling apart. Famine was taking over, and the people were suffering terribly. Josephus, a Jewish historian who witnessed it all, describes horrifying scenes. People starving, even turning to cannibalism in desperation. It's unimaginable, but that's the level of devastation the people of Jerusalem were facing. Then, in late August, the Romans finally broke through. They overwhelmed the defenders and set fire to the Jewish temple, one of the most sacred sites in Judaism. The destruction of the temple was a devastating blow, not just physically, but spiritually. Resistance continued for a short time after that, but by the end of September, the Romans had completely taken the city. They burned most of it to the ground, sparing only a few of its grand towers as a reminder of its former glory. The aftermath, it was brutal. Thousands were killed, many more were enslaved, and Jerusalem was left in ruins. The Romans celebrated their victory back in Rome with a massive triumph, and treasures from the Jewish temple were paraded through the streets. Titus' success in Jerusalem gave the Flavian dynasty a huge boost in prestige, but the real impact of the siege was felt in Jewish life and culture. With the temple gone, Jewish practices had to evolve. Sacrifices were no longer possible, so prayer and Torah study became the core of Jewish worship. This transformation helped shape what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism. At the same time, early Christians, followers of Jesus, started to distance themselves from their Jewish roots, which would eventually lead to the rise of Christianity as a distinct religion. As for Jerusalem, it was never the same. The Romans established a military camp on its ruins and eventually rebuilt the city as a Roman colony, barring Jews from entering. This moment, some say, set the stage for the next Great Jewish Revolt, known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. And the situation inside Jerusalem had become desperate. As Titus and the Roman legions tightened their grip, the city was filled with refugees celebrating Passover, making conditions inside even worse. The Jewish factions, already at odds with each other, became even more divided. The Zealots, led by Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala, blamed the moderates for the failure of the rebellion, and infighting reached tragic heights, with one faction even killing Eleazar ben Simon, another prominent leader. Meanwhile, attempts to negotiate peace with the Romans were crushed, despite the efforts of respected figures like Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was smuggled out in a coffin to appeal to the Roman commanders. Titus, seeing the chaos within the city, decided to play a waiting game. He constructed a wall around Jerusalem, effectively trapping its inhabitants inside. This strategy aimed to starve the city into submission, and with the Zealots destroying the food supplies in a bid to invoke divine intervention, the residents were left with little hope. Despite the dire circumstances, the defenders put up a fierce resistance. The Zealots continued their attacks, and even launched surprise assaults on the Roman positions. The Antonia fortress, which overlooked the temple, became a key point of Roman assault. After several failed attempts to breach the walls, the Romans finally managed to make their way into the fortress, although the fighting was intense and often chaotic. At one point, a Roman soldier accidentally set fire to part of the temple, an act that would lead to its ultimate destruction. Titus had originally planned to preserve the temple, possibly intending to convert it into a shrine for the Roman gods, but once the fire began, there was little he could do to stop it. The flames spread uncontrollably, engulfing the sacred structure and much of the city around it. Josephus, who was present during the siege, described the horrifying scenes as Roman soldiers surged through the city, slaughtering civilians, many of whom were unarmed and had nowhere to escape. The streets were filled with bodies, and the temple itself became a scene of devastation, with blood running down its steps as the flames consumed everything in their path. In the aftermath, the Roman legions systematically crushed the remaining pockets of resistance. Some Jewish defenders managed to flee through hidden tunnels, but many were captured or killed. Herod's palace fell in early September, and by the 8th of the month, Jerusalem was fully under Roman control. Titus, according to Josephus, ordered that the city be demolished, with only a few towers and sections of the western wall left standing as a reminder of the city's former grandeur. The destruction was thorough. The once beautiful city, with its gardens and grand buildings, was reduced to rubble. The lush suburbs became barren, and the landscape was scarred by war. Archaeological findings from the 20th century have confirmed the scale of this destruction, with traces of fire, collapsed buildings, and even scorched household items discovered in various parts of the city. Limestone vessels were shattered, glass objects warped from the heat, and a thick layer of ash covered many areas. In terms of casualties, Josephus claimed that over 1 million people perished during the siege, many of them due to starvation and disease, though some scholars doubt the accuracy of these numbers. What's clear, however, is that the devastation was enormous. The Romans enslaved thousands of survivors, while others were sold off or fled to distant lands. This marked the end of Jerusalem's rebellion against Rome. The city was left in ruins, and the Jewish population was scattered, leading to one of the most significant events in Jewish history, the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. And after the triumph, the Roman general Titus and his legions returned to Rome in celebration. Their victory was marked by a grand procession where they paraded the sacred items from the Temple of Jerusalem, including the menorah and the table of the bread of God's presence, which had only ever been seen by the temple's high priest. This remarkable display through the streets of Rome was later immortalized on the Arch of Titus, which still stands today. Among the spoils of war, over 700 Jewish prisoners were also paraded in chains, showcasing Rome's dominance over the rebellion. Among these captives were Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala, two prominent Jewish rebel leaders. Simon Bar Giora met a grim fate, executed by being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, having been condemned as a traitor to Rome. Meanwhile, John of Giscala was sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment, marking the symbolic end of their resistance. However, the end of the siege of Jerusalem was not the final chapter in the rebellion. There were still strongholds where Jewish rebels continued to resist, most notably at Herodium, Machaerus, and the mountain fortress of Masada. Over the next 2 years, the Romans crushed these pockets of resistance, but Masada, the last and most famous stronghold, held out the longest. In 73 CE, the Roman forces breached the walls of Masada. According to the historian Josephus, nearly all the Jewish defenders had taken their own lives before the Romans could capture them, choosing death over submission. With the fall of Masada, the First Jewish-Roman War officially came to an end. Decades later, in 132 CE, another revolt erupted, this time led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whose uprising would come to be known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The revolt was largely fueled by Roman policies, particularly the establishment of a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, on the ruins of Jerusalem, and the construction of a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount, which deeply offended Jewish religious sentiment. Bar Kokhba's revolt, supported by the Sanhedrin, initially succeeded in creating a short-lived independent Jewish state. However, by 135 CE, the Romans had crushed the rebellion. The aftermath of this revolt was devastating for the Jewish communities in Judea, far worse than the First Jewish-Roman War. Many scholars consider it a form of genocide, as entire towns and villages were depopulated. Yet, Jewish life continued to thrive in other regions of the land of Israel, including Galilee, the Golan, and the surrounding areas. In the aftermath, Emperor Hadrian sought to erase the memory of Judea itself, renaming the province Syria Palestina, a name intended to sever the connection between the Jews and their homeland. Rome celebrated its victories over the Jewish revolts in grand architectural monuments. The Arch of Titus, built around 82 CE, still stands as a testament to the fall of Jerusalem. Its bas-relief famously depicts Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of the temple, including the sacred menorah, in a victory procession. Another Arch of Titus, though less known, was built at the southeast entrance of the Circus Maximus by the Roman Senate around the same time, though only remnants of it remain today. In 75 CE, Emperor Vespasian ordered the construction of the Temple of Peace in Rome to commemorate the conquest of Jerusalem. It was said to house some of the most precious treasures of the Jewish temple, including the menorah. Additionally, the Colosseum in Rome, one of the most iconic structures of the ancient world, is believed to have been partially funded by the spoils from the Jewish wars. To further commemorate their victory, the Romans issued a series of coins called Judea Capta, featuring symbolic imagery celebrating the defeat of the Jewish people. These coins became widespread throughout the empire, reinforcing Rome's dominance. For the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem became a symbol of tragedy and reflection. The annual fast day of TishaBAv was observed to mourn the destruction of both the first and second temples, which, according to tradition, occurred on the same day. In the centuries following, some Jewish communities even adopted a new calendar, marking the year of the temple's destruction as Year Zero. In Jewish eschatology, the destruction of the temple was seen as divine punishment for the internal divisions and hatred that plagued Jewish society at the time. Many Jews, disillusioned by the destruction, turned away from their faith, while others found solace in the rising Christian movement, which had begun to distance itself from Judaism. Christianity, particularly in its early texts, framed the destruction of the temple as divine retribution for the rejection of Jesus. Yet, despite the devastation, Jerusalem never lost its significance in Jewish life. It remained a symbol of hope and renewal, and the belief in a third temple became a cornerstone of Orthodox Jewish faith, symbolizing the eventual restoration of Jewish national life.